Alors, bonjour. Si vous voulez prendre place, s'il vous plaît. Alors, bonjour à toutes, à tous. Très heureux de vous accueillir à cette 5e édition des conférences du doyen de la Faculté de médecine de l'Université de Montréal. Ces conférences ont été instaurées au début de mon mandat en 2020 et visent à créer un espace d'échange avec les chercheurs, les chercheuses dont les travaux se distinguent par leur rayonnement international. Cette édition des conférences du doyen s'inscrit dans le cadre du symposium INRS Université de Montréal, qui a été organisé conjointement avec le Centre Armand-Frappier, Santé Biotechnologie et l'Institut Courtois en innovation biomédicale. L'objectif de ce symposium est de renforcer les collaborations entre les équipes de l'Université de Montréal et de l'INRS autour de thématiques communes comme la microbiologie, l'infectiologie et le concept d'une seule santé. Le Centre Armand-Frappier joue un rôle de premier plan dans la formation de la relève scientifique et de la recherche en santé. Rappelons que son fondateur, le Dr Armand Frappier, est un médecin diplômé de notre faculté. Il a dirigé le département de bactériologie de l'Université de Montréal, qui est devenu notre département de microbiologie, infectiologie et immunologie. Il a aussi créé l'Institut de microbiologie et d'hygiène de l'Université de Montréal, qui a donné naissance à l'Institut Armand Frappier en 1975. Donc, ces liens historiques témoignent de nos racines communes et de notre vision partagée, celle d'une science au service de la santé des populations. Nous avons le plaisir aujourd'hui d'accueillir la Dr Rebecca F, qui est la directrice exécutive du Pasteur Network. Dr Grais est une spécialiste des études d'intervention en santé publique et des essais cliniques de nouveaux vaccins. Elle défend une approche inclusive de la recherche et œuvre activement pour le mentorat et la formation de la relève scientifique. Dr Grais est une diplômée de Johns Hopkins et de la Faculté de médecine de l'Université Paris-Saclay. Elle a signé plus de 200 publications et siège à plusieurs comités internationaux, dont l'Organisation mondiale de la santé. Elle dirige maintenant le Pasteur Network, qui est une alliance scientifique internationale unique en son genre, présente dans 25 pays sur 5 continents. Il réunit plus de 30 instituts unis par une même mission, faire progresser la santé mondiale grâce à la recherche, la formation et la surveillance épidémiologique. Héritier de Louis Pasteur, ce réseau favorise une science décentralisée et collaborative ancrée dans les réalités du terrain et à l'écoute des populations. Pendant la pandémie de COVID-19 notamment, ces instituts ont joué un rôle déterminant dans le partage de données génomiques, la mise au point de protocoles communs et la formation d'équipes locales capables de réagir rapidement aux crises sanitaires. La conférence d'aujourd'hui, la Dr Grais explorera justement comment la science peut contribuer à un monde plus sûr en mettant en lumière le rôle du réseau dans la prévention des pandémies et la réponse aux grands défis liés au changement climatique. Cette conférence est l'occasion de rappeler que notre faculté à l'Université de Montréal entend poursuivre et intensifier des partenariats avec les grandes institutions internationales. Nous sommes très fiers de nos collaborations structurantes avec plusieurs membres du Pasteur Network, dont l'INRS, l'Institut Pasteur de Paris, de Madagascar et du Maroc. Dans un monde maintenant marqué par les crises et la désinformation, la science garde ce pouvoir unique de rassembler au-delà des frontières. Le Pasteur Network en est un exemple formidable, une science ouverte, humaine et collaborative au service de la santé globale. Alors, Dr Grais, c'est un plaisir, c'est un honneur de vous accueillir à Montréal, à la Faculté de médecine, et la parole est à vous.
So, good evening, everyone. I'll speak in English, but en français, ça va aussi, également, pour les questions, or other languages. The first thing I want to do is, first of all, just to thank the University of Montréal and the INRS for hosting this symposium. For me personally and for the network, it's great to see these collaborations being formed. Yeah, so I thought about what to say, because what I do has pretty much nothing to do with what all of you are doing, but I hope you'll find it interesting. And so the best way that I could think about to explain what I do is by a joke that some of you may have heard. So a physicist, a chemist, and an economist or mathematician, depends on who tells the joke, are stranded on a desert island. They have nothing to eat. They're starting to get ornery with each other. And one day, a can of beans washes up on the shore. And they rush to the shore, they get the can of beans, they're all excited. And the physicist immediately says, okay, we can put the can of beans down, and I'll make sure that the rays of the sun are positioned in a way that we can make the can explode, and then we can eat the beans. The chemist says, no. The chemist says, we're going to take the can of beans, we're going to put it in the water, and then the salt water is going to slowly corrode the outside of the bean can, and then we can scoop it up and we can eat the beans. And the mathematician or the economist, however you prefer, says, no, we're not going to do either one of those things. We're just going to assume that we have a can opener. So a lot of my job is based on assumptions. And they're based on assumptions that all of you as good scientists know that you should always question. So what you see on this map, which looks very fancy, is a map of the world of what was formerly called the Réseau des Instituts Pasteur. And it was started 135 years ago by Louis Pasteur himself. And Louis Pasteur, when he started the Institut de Pasteur in Paris, decided that one of the things he needed to do was to try and replicate l'Institut Pasteur around the world with the belief that science has no borders. So he sent out his students, principally to former French colonies, to create similar institutions. But you all know, lots has happened in the past 135 years. The world has changed. Some of those countries don't exist. We went through independence and a variety of other things. So this network changed significantly over time. Some institutions came and went, and some of them, in some cases, even disappeared. So in 2021, there was a significant, actually, no, that's not right. In 2019, there was a change to the governance of this network, which included a name change. And so what was formerly known as the Réseau des Instituts Pasteur became the Pasteur Network. So I'll talk about it a little bit, and then happy to talk about anything you want, questions related or unrelated to what I'm going to talk about. So the dean mentioned this. There are 30 institutions, at least 30, which are all over the world. We have 54 national reference centers, 17 WHO collaborating centers. The Pasteur Network is qualified as a non-state actor at WHO. So part of that is it gives us rights to discuss things at the WHO in areas where other institutions are not allowed into the conversation. And it also means that we abide by as apolitical as we can be. You all know that different countries have different foreign policies. And when you're dealing with a network that spans all 5 continents, different countries, which include Iran, they include Russia, it includes Hong Kong. Canada's very easy. Thank you for being Canadian. Brazil, everything else. You can't really follow the foreign policy of one government. So we very much try to be apolitical. We have a suite of BSL-3 labs, and then you see those people there. That's how the governance works in the network. The president of our board of directors is a guy named Mario Moreira. He's the president of Fiocruz, or the Fundación Oswaldo Cruz, for those of you that know that, in Brazil. It's one of the oldest public health institutions in Latin America. Yasmin, who's the vice president, is the head of the Institut Pasteur in Paris. Myself, and then we have a chair of what we call our strategic advisory board, which is chaired by Peter Piot. If any of you work in HIV, you may know his name. He was the creator of UNAIDS, or ONU-SIDA. So I'm going to go back to the change in governance. So what happened up until 2019 is, although it was called a réseau, it really wasn't. It was really just a group of institutions that were linked together through this idea of what's called Pasteurian values. That sounds really fancy and complicated. It's not. It's really just the Declaration of Human Rights. So most of the institutions abided by that without really knowing. And they didn't really have mechanisms to work together other than through the informal. If somebody knows somebody or somebody has contact with somebody else, but there wasn't a way to facilitate this ecosystem. And the COVID-19 pandemic was one where this informal network really came to a head. And the director of our institute in Hong Kong, his name is Leo Poon, personally sent around reactives and sent around the information about the pandemic to all the members of the network, but it was extremely informal. So when you see this informality, something needed to happen. And so what happened was this change to the way that the network functions. And a dedicated entity, that's what I work on, and do a lot of cat herding with the other people that work for me, one of whom is in the audience, Oscar, who handles the Americas, is what we try and do is try and establish a way and develop the ecosystem so that scientists, public health practitioners, and clinicians can work together all over the world. I'm absolutely going to screw up your name, who just spoke on Zika in the blue shirt. That was great. And his presentation, and I remember reading your application actually, is something that has great relevance to what the network is doing, and it fits along with our objectives, and we hope is a way to help contribute to younger scientists to build their careers. And we have many other programs like that. But so what did this change mean? This change meant, and it's showed here on this slide, is that we need to ensure that each member of the network, all of those institutions on that map, are autonomous, of course, that they work in some way towards the collective interest of the network, that we base things on equitable partnerships. So that can sometimes be a word that people throw around. It's a little harder to do in science than it appears. Who gets credit for what? How does it work when you're dealing with institutions with a lot of money versus institutions with less money? So there's a lot that goes into that little sentence there. And that we want to base everything on knowledge and resource sharing. So you can see here that there are just some things listed, which is what we did to change and develop a way of working across institutions that would allow for scientific ideas to thrive across an ecosystem. So as a part of that, and you all probably know this, there's people in the room who are older and who are professors or who are deans or who have to raise money and have to do things. And that requires a different type of work. And so as a part of this network, what we needed to do was also build a group of people together who are well known in their own fields and could help advocate for the members of the network and advocate for the network as a whole. And so they're listed here. And what we do with this group of people is double check information about what we're doing as a network, and then they help us. They use their own political capital to help the network in various instances or places where they're working. And they essentially help develop this idea that the network as a whole is there to help respond to crises, help respond to epidemics, and help respond to situations, whether they're considered a crisis or not. So when you take the entire network as a whole, it's actually really big. Well, I shouldn't say that. At the same time, it's really big, and on the other hand, it's also very small globally. But it's quite unique in terms of what it represents. So we have about 45,000 researchers in the network, which is quite substantial. We have a presence in traditionally Francophone areas, and there isn't really anything else which exists like that. We have leading public health facilities. So I mentioned, for example, Fiocruz in Brazil, which is the biggest and most well-known in Latin America. We have a footprint of critical research, which spans from basic research all the way through applied research. And in many instances, 8 members of our network are vaccine manufacturers or diagnostic manufacturers For those of you younger scientists in the room, that's a good thing to keep in mind because papers are papers, but probably what you really want is for your work to be scaled up so that it can benefit others. And then in terms of R&D and innovation, we have multiple other opportunities across the network in terms of developing those capacities. But so what do we do actually? What are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to improve health through science and service, and that's underpinned by global solidarity. This idea that if you work together, you can go better, you can do better than you can if you work alone. That sounds very trite. A lot of people say that, but in order to do that, you actually need to invest in the structure to help support people working together. Otherwise, it doesn't tend to happen. And so the way we did that in the network is we framed 4 strategic pillars where everybody in the network sort of says, yes, I'm going to work on this to the best degree possible that I have, and I'm going to support this. So those are all underpinned by what you see here. So what are those things? So this is a little bit of a complicated figure. It's called a theory of change, for those of you that have seen that type of graphic before. I have no idea whether you've seen this before. So theories of change are sort of when people say to you, yes, we'll give you a lot of money, but if we give you that money, how are you going to go from point A to point B? And in a network of this size, what that means is laying out how that's going to happen. And so along the bottom line, in pink there, is what we call our equity pillar, and that deals with assuming that we want people to have equitable partnerships, we want people to work together. How do you do that? So you ensure that good governance practices are in place, you ensure that there's financial equity and sustainability, and you also want to reinforce your external engagement and your public-facing work as a whole. The pillar focuses, which are if we're going from the bottom up, which are in green there, are the ones which are most relevant to all of you. The first one is reinforcing epidemic intelligence and preparedness, and here it's actually got a focus on climate-sensitive infectious diseases. And I'll talk about that in a second. One of our big case studies is dengue. So dengue pretty much affects or will affect everyone. And so it's a great federating area of research. The second is everything linked to R&D and innovation. And there's also a focus particularly on tools, medical tools for the global south. Often they're not adapted. As any of you that work in sort of drug development, I don't know if any of you do, in drug development or vaccine development or diagnostic development, there's a big split between high-income countries and lower-income countries. The last one is to create multidisciplinary knowledge communities. That's just a fancy word for saying that we want the person that works on, our postdoctoral scientist, you working on Zika, we should make sure that you are aware of the work on Zika, which is occurring in the network. Or that the person who works on Buruli ulcer in Cameroon knows the person that works on Buruli ulcer in the Central African Republic. In terms of the outcomes, what we're trying to do is that I mentioned that earlier, is we're trying to use science to improve health and doing it in a way which is as equitable as possible. And on the top line, you'll see there where it says impact. Those are just the big sort of large-scale things that we're most interested in. So over this journey, which took place from this change in governance, which also involved a change in the name and a change to way of working, we've been putting in place larger scale approaches, which are continuing, and you can see on this graph here over time, which help to ensure that the network can actually become an actor in and of itself. How do you make collective action work? So of those pillars, this is kind of difficult to read in the audience, so that's okay. I'll just talk about some of what we call the flagship projects that we do across the network. Some of those may eventually interest some of you in the room. So this one, in terms of epidemic intelligence and preparedness, is we have something called the Climate Health Observatory Accelerator, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth. We are the secretariat for something called the Collective Action on Dengue. So believe it or not, and you probably do believe this, in the world of dengue, everybody doesn't really talk to one another. There's not really one place you can go to find information about dengue, whether that's the virus, whether that's interventions in terms of vector control, whether that's other research that is happening, whether it's tools if you're a government. And so we're aiming to have a clearinghouse of sorts to ensure that dengue doesn't fall off of this agenda. We have a wastewater surveillance flagship project in Africa, which I'll talk about. Then we're also looking at, in 2026, looking at doing something on AMR across the network as a whole. Also, we're starting to develop a regional outbreak task force by continent to see how those can be better adapted. And then we're also looking at how to do data and sample sharing across all of these institutions. I can't really promise anything there, but we're going to try. In the second one, which looks at R&D, as I mentioned earlier, we have 8 vaccine manufacturers in the network. And so that we've specifically put together a specific group for them. If any of you have ever done anything with vaccine manufacturers, they do not really like to talk to one another. They don't like to share information. They're people and groups. There's a lot of intellectual property involved. And so what we've done there is try and create a safe and secure space for them to share information that they may not want to share publicly. And to start that out, we did a scenario exercise. We did a whole exercise. We did avian influenza, and we invited all of the 8 manufacturers to Morocco. It was fantastic, because when you go into a room with people like that, they all sat down, and I sort of stood up and was like, great, so happy you're here in Morocco. Morocco's great. Let's go through an exercise, and let's use avian influenza as an example. What would happen if there was large-scale human-to-human transmission of avian influenza? What would you guys do? And of course, the first day, all 8 of them, the representatives, sort of stood there and they're like buttoning their coats and they're like, we're fine, it's all good, we got everything under control, we could handle it, no problem. And then over the course of the 3 days, they finally came to the conclusion that actually, no, they could not. They didn't know what they were doing, and they probably had to work together. So what that initiative is really about talking, sharing, trust building, and ensuring that there's more peer-to-peer learning that has happened in the past. We'd like to also start in 2026 R&D and innovation scientific meetings, which we haven't yet done, which is specifically looking at those aspects in whatever it is across the network. We want to try and start a bioaccelerator. I admittedly know nothing about venture capital, about how to raise the money for this, but we will find the people that do. And that would be to help jumpstart some of the work that all of you are doing in order to ensure that it is translated into something that can impact human health. We'd like to also address mother and child health, which is a little bit more complex, but is something which is often forgotten, as you all know, and is something that warrants the attention of the network. And then the last one, which has both in terms of access to information, access to platforms, but also in terms of the constraints due to climate change, we'd like to start a series of virtual labs to help train people that might not be able to get from point A to point B, or to come up with ways to share these platforms with others so that that work can be done. At the break, David Chetney, who's here, was mentioning that to me, where he met one of the students that we had at our annual meeting in Vietnam, and he instantly said, I think I can help you do that. So part of the role of this network is putting those things together, giving the opportunity to a student, and also ensuring that all of the investment that has been made, certainly in David's lab and the people he works with, is put to use and ensured that it's used for the common good. The last one on knowledge communities I mentioned. So we've put together working groups. Sounds fancy, but it's just to make sure that people are able to have a space to talk to one another thematically. We currently have 10 of them, and they span across the world. And so that it serves as a way to share information, but also for people just to do networking to one another. We have some educational sponsorship programs with South-to-South mobility, where our ultimate dream scenario is to have PhD programs for people in the network where you have the choice of location for your doctoral degree. So we're looking at HKU, which is in Hong Kong, looking at Fiocruz in Brazil, Pasteur in Paris, and why not the University of Montreal or Université de Laval, precisely because we have students from all over the world, and as you all know, sometimes visas can be complicated, sometimes language can be complicated, so we want to provide them with as much opportunity as possible. The last one, which is what we do now, is we do short courses, which are offered across the network in a variety of different subjects, where members of the network apply to do a course, and then it's offered to people that work there across it. The last one, this isn't really your cup of tea, but it's quite important, at least in my eyes, which deals with setting up the what do you owe one another and how do you work together. So this is a very busy slide, but what you should take away from this slide is that building scientific ecosystems both require specific investment, and it also means that a group of people have to consciously ensure that it's done. So believe it or not, before I worked here, and I was the first director of this newly incarnated network, and I asked, well, what do you have that links all of these institutions together? And there wasn't anything. So we put that in place as a collaboration agreement, which just kind of lays out, how do you work together? What are the things that you should do? And there's a whole bunch of other things listed there. But so I just want to quickly talk about some of these flagship projects in more detail. They can also serve as templates or different things that you all can work on as well. So the first one, in terms of responding to global threats, is we need both improved early warning systems, which are federated and are community sourced. So by community, that can mean very local, all the way to national, all the way to regional. And in our case, it would be something that spanned the network. So I'll speak about one in a second on wastewater surveillance. And then the second one here is this climate and health observatory network, which we're setting up. So I actually was not supposed to be here. I was supposed to be at COP, which is in Belém in Brazil, but it was $2,000 a night for a hotel room. And having been to previous COPs, I sometimes go back and forth on the fence about whether it's a great idea to fly across the world to spend time with a whole bunch of fancy people in air conditioning and talk about how climate change is bad. So decided not to go. I've been to previous ones. But one of the big issues with climate change is the fact that we don't have enough data. So the people that are most likely to be affected by climate change are the people where very little data exists. And many of those data deserts are within the Pasteur Network. That's not to exclude areas where there is a lot of data. It's of course important there, but we also need to ensure that work that is done on climate and health is documented so that that information can then be used and translated for policymakers. So the way that we've been doing that is we received a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation and, wow, I'm going to try and pronounce, the Hong Kong Jockey Club Charities Trust, which is a very large philanthropy in Hong Kong and China. And they recently started being interested in funding outside of China. And so the Pasteur Network was one of the first beneficiaries of that. And the three components of this project are not complicated. They are to advance generalizable tools and practices through exemplars, of which we have one in Latin America, one in Africa, and one in Asia. To create the foundation of these observatories by developing a fellowship program, which we have. We have 18 fellows, which are supported by this project, which are all based in low and middle income countries. And what they do, whatever their scientific research is they think about and they document how it interacts with climate. And in addition to that, they spend time going around and talking to other researchers in the institution where they work to remind them that what they do may have an impact in climate. That can be both on the adaptation side, on the mitigation side. It can be in any way possible, but to document that. They also have a specific training program to help scientists learn how to speak to ministers of finance, of which scientists are generally very, very bad at. And so it's a way to help them translate their work to an audience which may not be as receptive to the work that they're doing, but it's something that they need to understand how to do. And the last part is we created a platform to share global goods. And so it's a way for people to communicate, but also to share information. For wastewater, which is one of the other examples, we've developed this laboratory surveillance network on wastewater in Africa. It's funded by the Gates Foundation. We're starting with hepatitis E, cholera, and measles, and trying to put together a more federated system, which is aiming to provide information for decision makers, but also aims to validate much of those processes. So wastewater is something where sometimes there are methods which are validated for a certain pathogen, sometimes there's not. And so we're trying to do that across this network as a whole. Wastewater holds promise in a lot of these areas because it can potentially be faster. It can help with that early warning component. And in some ways, it can be cheaper if it's linked appropriately to clinical decision makers. In terms of that vaccine manufacturers group, that's another big flagship program of ours. That's why I was talking about we need people to work together and to trust one another. So there's a lot of work that just goes in there. But what's interesting here is the members of the network agreed and got together and agreed to work on projects which would span across the other manufacturers. That's extremely rare that would happen. And so they've met multiple times. They also agreed and signed a declaration in Rio de Janeiro last year to ensure that the ultimate outcome of the work that they developed was in a way where access was included from the beginning. And so on a very, very small scale of the planet, this is something that we hope to contribute. So overall, what you see here are some of these very large global scale projects. So wastewater, climate and health. We also have the manufacturers listed in yellow, that biotechnology accelerator, which we'd like to do, the PhD students, federative research, so work which is done across the network. There are some great examples here at the INRS and also at the University of Montreal. And all of this needs to be done while advancing equity. And when I say that one more time, it's not just to add a whole bunch of paper and strengthen governance, but it's also under this belief that if we assume that this network isn't going to work, it's definitely not. So you have to assume that it is and give people the right mechanisms to do so. And I hope that all of you will become interested in this. It's a way to see how your individual work can be upscaled globally. It's a way to meet other people. It's a way to have your work be enriched in a way that can sometimes be difficult. And it's a great platform just to have some fun also. So I'll end just with our most recent annual meeting. So we put together an annual meeting every year, which before I started used to be only 30 people in a room for a couple hours. It was only the directors. And so over the past couple of years, we've been trying to change that. And this year in Vietnam, the only speakers had to be under the age of 40, which was shocking to a lot of people. But I think it worked. I'll look at ACAD and David. And the idea was to highlight young researchers and to ensure that they had a place to be. And what you see here is just an advertisement to that, a photo of that, and then underneath it is a document which came out, which was published alongside the World Health Summit. I have no idea if you guys know what that is. It's kind of like this big, what is it? It's like a Davos for scientists and health professionals. and it's held in Berlin, and lots of fancy people go there, and people that have a lot of influence. And we were invited, the Pasteur Network was invited to write one of the pieces that went along for discussion for that. And so that is something which is important for visibility, but is also important for all of the institutions which belong to the network, because it's a way to ensure that members of the network's voices are heard, and also what they do is seen at a much larger scale. So I apologize not for giving a scientific talk. I'm also not a basic scientist. I tried that and had to leave that, was not very good at it. But I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about this, and I want to thank you again for inviting me.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions, commentaires de la part des membres? Il y a des micros, vous pouvez vous avancer. Et 4. Pendant que les 4 s'installent, vous avez un réseau formidable à travers le monde pour la surveillance, impact climatique ou même pour les épidémies. Et quels sont les liens avec les partenaires comme CDC ou l'équivalent en Afrique, par exemple?
So, pour les partenaires, en Afrique en particulier, on a un partenariat avec Africa CDC, qui est l'agence la plus importante en Afrique, et aussi avec l'OMS Afro et WAHO. WAHO, c'est l'organisation de santé pour Afrique de l'Ouest. Et pour Afrique du Nord, pour certaines, c'est pas considéré comme Afrique continentale, mais ils vont essayer de faire changer ça. Et pour cela, il y a aussi d'autres mécanismes pour faire avancer et assurer que l'information qui est produite dans ces instituts progresse et est appropriée par les décisionnaires. Et on a exactement pareil dans les autres continents.
Parfait. Merci. Eka?
Merci, Rebecca. It's, as always, super impressive, all the work that has been done with the network. So I have 3 questions, and I'm going to try and be brief because I know people have to catch the metro. The first question is, you talk a lot about equity, and I think it's a vision that has come to the network more and more over the years, and what I'm observing is like how we ensure equity given the disproportional funding for research in different regions, and how we coordinate all these efforts given that the major needs, we see them at the South. The second question is how we're going to deal with the NIH cuts, which, have effect globally, anything that has to do with One Health, infectious diseases, how we're going to function with all the changes in CDC, and given the new guidelines from HHMI, how the network sees open science.
So anybody that needs to catch the metro, please, because it will take me a couple minutes to answer these. So the first one on equity, so I say this not as a joke, but I think you have to assume equity. And in terms of assuming it, it also means putting into place mechanisms to explain to people what does that mean. One of the biggest problems we have in the network is ACAT was mentioning the North and the South divide or the resource divide. But lots of times people don't actually know how to put that in practice. What does it mean to have an equitable partnership? So one of the things that we did is we had institutions, we provide them with information. One of those is called the Trust Code. There are many of these. There's lots of other examples. Many institutions have them. And it's like a step-by-step guide where if you have a partnership between a high-income group and a low-income group, how do you ensure that those benefits and those resources are shared in an equitable manner? And then one other thing on equity, which is I think it's important to consistently repeat it over and over and over and over again and provide people with mechanisms to do so. The second one on the NIH cuts, So it's not just NIH. It's also European governments. It's pretty much most of them. NIH is just the big bad behemoth here. In terms of the network itself and the members of the network, very few of them were impacted directly from NIH cuts. There are individual researchers who were impacted directly, but the institutions themselves, much less. The way that we handle that was a complete accident. It sounds like we are complete geniuses to have done this, but actually it was an accident, which is when we started the Pasteur Network, one of the funding principles that we have, and we have a funding guide for the network itself in terms of what I do with my team, is to have a diversity of funders who come from all over the world. And that just turned out to be the right thing to do in terms of that. In terms of other aspects of the consequences of that, again, I think it's more than just the US. It's certainly European governments are the same and others. One of the difficulties that we're facing now is that wealthy countries are now putting together philosophies on science funding and health funding, which must demonstrate a return to investment to the country itself. So as opposed to using the phrase, which is usually called overseas development assistance or other scientific grants, you now have to demonstrate the return on investment to France, to the Netherlands, to the UK, which is somewhat problematic. But as a consequence of that, the network is involved in something which is called the Accra Reset. You are all international people. The Accra Reset is African governments who are getting together. They've gotten together 4 or 5 times now, and to relook at their own financing, to do more domestic financing. The same thing is happening in Asia. It actually happened last week in Singapore. So there are some positive momentums. The last one on open science is, well, that's what we're trying to do. I don't know how successful we'll be. One of the difficulties with anything related to open science, and I'm sure you all know this, I mean, even things like publishing fees and open access journals, it's quite wide-ranging. It actually costs quite a bit of money to do open science. And we're having a bit of a difficult time finding philanthropists and others who are interested in doing that, but we'll just keep on going.
That was very, very interesting, and I'm glad to see that you support young investigators as well. I was wondering about, you mentioned on a couple of slides your AMR initiatives, and I was wondering whether it's more on the surveillance side or the therapeutics or all of the above?
All of the above, and we haven't started it yet, and we haven't met, but you are more than welcome to become the director of that. I should have mentioned that.
Yeah, probably not going to happen. But I think there are amazing opportunities, and for example, we're already collaborating with Ivo Boneka and Christophe Zimmer at Pasteur, who got a similar large awards to the Pandemic Stop AI grant that we got, and thanks to contributions from the Faculty of Medicine. And so there are things happening already across network, if we're part of the network, that could be very, very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. What we'd like to do is to see that extended even more, and in terms of the scale up. Yeah.
There's a lot of people who would be interested in that in other countries as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah, and don't forget about AMR. The job is available. Yes.
Ahmed, une dernière question?
Oui, bonjour, Rebecca F. Je suis directeur de bureau de la responsabilité sociale à la faculté de médecine. Donc, vous avez beaucoup évoqué dans les missions et les valeurs de Pasteur Network le partenariat équitable. Alors, j'imagine que les enjeux ne sont pas évidents en matière de recherche, surtout entre les pays à fort revenu par rapport aux pays à plus faible revenu. Donc, comment arrivez-vous à construire, à maintenir un partenariat équitable en santé, et comment arrivez-vous à partager de façon équitable les bénéfices de la recherche entre les niveaux des pays?
Donc, la première chose, c'est qu'on essaye. Il n'y a pas un seul bâton magique. La deuxième chose, c'est qu'on a 135 ans d'une manière à faire versus 3. So, il y a aussi l'histoire qui joue. Mais par rapport à ça, ce qu'on essaie de mettre en place, c'est tous les mécanismes et les possibilités pour que les gens puissent aussi comprendre qu'est-ce que ça veut dire, Ça, c'est quelque chose qu'on a trouvé un peu partout, qui n'est pas simplement une fonction de où la personne est. On a les guides comme le Trust Code qu'on a mentionné. Il y a les guides, en fait, maintenant, sur les publications. Je ne sais pas si vous êtes au courant de ça, mais le Lancet, par exemple, maintenant, demande qu'est-ce qui est le rôle et il refuse de publier, en fait, un article sur une maladie qui n'est pas présente dans un pays à haut revenu par un PI de haut revenu, dans un pays de haut revenu. Donc, il y a les mécanismes qu'il faut faire. Dans la gouvernance de le réseau, on a aussi mis ça en place. Chaque membre du réseau contribue financièrement de notre fonctionnement. Et quand nous, on a commencé, en fait, c'était égal. C'est-à-dire que l'RCA a payé le même montant que la France. Et on a changé ça d'être pondéré, en fait, par le revenu. Et on a d'autres programmes incitatifs où on demande, en fait, aux gens de suivre certaines règles et de le montrer. Mais je pense que c'est plutôt une histoire de continuer. Il ne faut pas lâcher. Et peut-être dans 10 ans, ça sera plus installé. Mais comme c'est un changement de culture, parfois ça prend longtemps.
Alors, merci beaucoup, Rebecca. Thank you very much. Merci à toutes et à tous d'avoir été présents. Ceci clôt la conférence, mais ça clôt également le symposium conjoint INRS Université de Montréal. Merci encore pour la photo, hein, c'est ça? Oui.